glad you're here with us. We're continuing in our series on 7 words of love. And when we broke down this series, the word that I was given was the word help. And I thought about that word, and I'm like, help, that's a weird word to speak on the 7 words of love. And this was, 3, 4, 5 months ago. My thoughts instantly went to danger, fear, all the things that every good boy loves to have in his life. And so the word help was something that I don't want to yell for help because I want to live through that danger. And I processed through a story that I remember right when we went to Haiti after the earthquake, and I've shared this story with a few people. But it was right after the earthquake, and we're driving in a car. Palmer's driving. I'm in the back seat, which caused me to yell help instantly anyway. But as we're driving into Port-au-Prince, we're driving deeper, and as we're turning and going through these streets, you're seeing destruction and chaos, and you're seeing people just walking that are completely lost. And you can just tell there was just massive destruction, massive pain. And remember, we came down this hill, and as we're coming down the hill, we turned left, and we are now in the exact epicenter of the earthquake. You couldn't tell where a building started and where another one ended because it was just rubble, just rocks everywhere, people climbing all over, looting, fighting, yelling, screaming, and this is beginning to collapse on the car as we're walking, or as we're driving down. The road is disappearing, and it is just carnage. And I remember sitting there thinking, we probably shouldn't be here. And I look around and I realize we're the only car down here. We need help. In that exact moment, a riot broke out, people collapsed against the car, and Palmer ran into something that sounded like a metal rod shot right through the middle of our engine. And I thought for sure, we're done. I need help. I looked in the car and I realized I'm faster than 5 of the 6 guys in the car, so at least I have that going for me. And then Palmer begins to yell, we hit a metal bucket, we hit a metal bucket, it's okay, it's okay. I said, Palmer, we need to turn around. And he said, that's a good idea. So Palmer does a 34-point turn, and he begins to turn around and drive out. And as we're driving out, I will always hold on to that memory because the word help didn't come out of my mouth, but it was every part of my being. It shook me to the absolute core. It was a feeling that I just will never forget. The next day, we're outside of the city. We're in a tent city. There's green grass everywhere, and you have these tents all over the place. And at the top of the hill, there's this huge house that they're using for doctors. And our doctors are up in there, and I'm standing there right outside this tent trying to talk to this man. And all of a sudden, the only way I can explain is it felt like a nuclear bomb went off 1,000 miles below me and yet was right there at my feet. It was instantaneous. It was unbelievably loud. It was like nothing I've ever experienced. It was an aftershock, and it was just powerful. The words help couldn't even come out of my mouth because, again, it overtook everything of who I was, and I just froze. I looked up, and I watched our doctors leaping out of the windows. I watched as the other people around watched our doctors leaping out, laughing at them. And then the man that I was talking to, all he does is he takes his hands, and he just puts them up in the air, and he just starts singing praise songs. And I asked, I said, what's going on? And they said they believe this is the end times. And so they're singing praise hymns. Help. You know, that has a way to come in and out of our life in different situations and different stories and different experiences. As I'm processing through what help means, what it means to live in danger or fear, as I begin going down that road and looking at it from that perspective, then the coronavirus starts. And all of us now are asked to stay at home. Now, my house, I have 1.5 acres. I have 28 chickens. I get 24 eggs a day. We've raised all our own meat. I've got a garden that can feed you for years. So I wasn't crying help. I was thinking, this is amazing. I could stay in this little bubble for years. And then I began to realize that's exactly what it was. I was living in my own bubble. And so as we began to watch the news and hear the stories of people around the world that were struggling and suffering, I realized that we're living in this bubble, and I'm ignoring everything. And so we as a church, we as a family, me as a person, as a human being on this planet, I have to do what I can to offer help. And then as that proceeds, the doors slowly begin to open, and people are eventually allowed to leave their houses, and we begin to go back into society. And then the injustice that happened to George Floyd happened. And it caused, I believe, all of us to stop and kind of take a step back. Because as he's laying there screaming, "I can't breathe," he's looking to everyone around and he's saying, "Help." I think we have a tendency when we live in our own little bubbles to think about, oh, if I was there, I would have done this or I would have done that. And we relive, we look back on moments in our life, or we look back on hurtful experiences and you say, if I was there, this is what I would have done. But you see, the problem was we just all went from our little bubbles, exposed back into the world, and had to look at this incident that tore communities apart. And we all processed this differently. And because we lived in our bubbles for a couple months, we're even more now living in the world of social media. And so we begin to write our opinions. And we begin to write things to other people. And we begin to try to tell people, this is how you should actually believe. And unfortunately, what is heard then is, you know what? You need help. And so that word help then changes again. See, that word can radically divide us as humans, but it can also bring us together. You see, the Jesus I believe in was a Jesus who said, I came to this world for everyone, for all of us, for every single human on the planet Earth. And when people cry for help, that can bring pain, or that can bring division or misunderstanding. But if I place myself at the feet of Jesus, if I place myself in his story and allow that to change me, that cry for help then can bring hope, it can bring peace, it can bring healing, it can bring reconciliation. And so my view of the word help has changed. You see, what I realize, the most important thing that I can do when somebody calls for help is to walk with the other, to walk with the person that may not look like me, that may not think like me. And as I walk with them, I'll get into this in a bit, I stay silent, I stay quiet. I listen and I learn and I grow, and I try to understand what their path is like, what their walking is like, what their journey is like. Walk with the other. At some point then I have to sit with them. I have to sit with the person. And when you sit with someone, you put yourself at their level, their eyes, their thoughts, their feelings. You see, Jesus continually was teaching on the simpleness of what it means to follow him. In John 13:34, it says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. You want to change the world? Love one another, period. You want to bring hope and healing to the world? Love one another, period. You really want to offer help to our world, our society, the people that are all around us? Love one another, period. And this is where Jesus starts. He just says, I need you to love one another, period. And then we have a tendency to add all these different things, the way to do this, how to do this, our thesis, our philosophy, our plan of attack, the way to do it. And then Jesus has this way to say, here's what I need you to do. You see, the disciples, as they were following Jesus in Matthew chapter 18, verse 1, you can open it up in your Bible, or let's be honest, just look at it at the bottom right here. In Matthew 18:1, it says, about this time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, which of us is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Which one of us is most right? Which one of us is more like you? Which one of us, if you were to go into battle, would you take with you first? Who do you think represents you the best? And unfortunately, from this point on, I believe we continually struggle with humans. Which one of us is right? And so Jesus simply does this. Jesus, it says, he called a little child to him, put the child among them, and then he said, I tell you the truth, unless you turn from your sins and become like little children, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. Now, if I'm one of those disciples that's standing there, again, easier to look back and place myself in this situation. If I'm standing there, I'm arguing with all my friends, which one of us is the greatest? It has to be me. And then Jesus brings this little child and says, look, this is the type of faith you need to have. The simplicity, this is what it means. My teachings, as Jesus is saying, you're blowing this out of proportion. Love one another, period. I continually in my life have gone back to this scriptures, and I found myself oftentimes getting lost, and I found myself dealing with pain or asking for help. And I found what has brought me the most joy is when I'm able to read the teachings of Jesus and find him at his simplest moments. The faith of a child. Oftentimes we have a tendency to forget what it's like to be a child or to have a child. Because the life of a child, let's be honest, is easy. They don't have to worry about anything else that's going on because the only thing that they are concerned about is what is right here in this world. And I know this because a year ago, and I've talked about him, this little boy named Monroe, my grandson, came into my life. He was a year and a half old, and my wife and I started to raise him. So my wife flew up, she got him, she flew home with this little 1.5-year-old boy. He's scared, he's crying, and I remember the moment when he walked off the plane and they're walking through security and he's pushing his little cart and he just kind of looks at me with this fear of like, I don't know who you are. So I picked him up and I held him, I gave him a hug, and I just told him, I said, it's okay, buddy. Internally, I imagine him, without realizing what he's saying, he was screaming, help. So for this past year, we have gone from almost being empty nesters to now starting all over with a 1.5-year-old boy. And the funny thing is there are no words that come out of his mouth, and yet I've figured out how to communicate with him. Better yet, he's figured out how to communicate with me. He said Monroe is this boy who is filled with life and is 100% boy. So he is running and screaming and yelling. And if he needs something, he flies into the room and he'll just look at you and just say, knee! And he just screams at you, knee, knee, knee. And he says it over and over again. And if I have just sat down in my chair and I'm tired and I'm exhausted, and he looks right in my eyes and he just says, knee. And if I say to him, hey, why don't you go ask Gigi? No, knee. He's learned the word no. What about somebody else? Do I really have to help you? Can I just sit here? Knee. And it's until you stand up, it's knee. And then as he's walking towards this area where he needs help, he begins to walk and he's constantly looking back to making sure you're following him. You get to that place where he's walking and it's still knee, 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 knee. And then he gets to this place where he needs help and he drops straight to the ground and he begins to hit it and he'll just keep saying knee, 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 knee until you sit with him. And if you're not close enough, he'll scoot you closer and he'll pull you in and he brings you into his world. And it's this beautiful experience. And what I realize is I've been living with this little boy. When people cry out for help, there's so much truth to just walking with them. Monroe just needs me to be with him. He just needs me to walk with him. And when somebody is struggling or hurting or in pain, and they have the courage to reach out and say, I need help. What you need to do then is just follow, just walk. They talked in ancient times, they said to have the faith you follow in the steps of the rabbi. And what that meant was to follow close enough to your teacher that you just inherited his teachings. You just breathed them in. You became a part of them. It's the same thing when we go through suffering, when we're asking for help. When somebody is hurting, the best thing that you can do with them is to walk with them. And sitting may be actually sitting on the ground with them, but it may just be sitting and putting yourself in their presence. When I'm sitting in with Monroe, we're eye to eye. We're looking directly at each other. I'm in his world. I'm seeing what he's seeing. And that is how we are called to go through life, to walk with the other. That person may or may not look like you. They may or may not think like you. They may or may not even act like you. But we are called to walk with the other and then to sit with one another. If you know somebody, or you've had somebody that's gone through hurting or their tragedy or the loss of a loved one or injustice, they don't need your words outside of the word, I'm sorry. when they're crying out for help, what they need is your presence. They need you sitting down with them, being with them, experiencing life with them. You see, when we come across people that are hurting, do we walk with them or do we walk past them? Jesus tells a story in Luke chapter 10. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And as Jesus is telling this story, there's an expert in the law, and it starts like this. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? Jesus, as a good teacher, answers a question with a question. He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? You see, the answer that the man gives is the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6. Every Jewish person, regardless of their age, knew that this was the answer. How do I inherit eternal life? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul. And the second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. They knew it, but they didn't fully know how to live it. And so the question, when he says he's trying to justify himself, they're not trying to get to this place of deeper learning, deeper growth in Jesus. They're trying to test him. You see, they've heard of this Jesus who's been walking around their land and their area, and he keeps saying this phrase, love one another, period, regardless where you're from, regardless of your background. And so now this question, and who is my neighbor? You see, the interesting thing about this passage right here is a lot of theologians believe that this is a real story. It wasn't a parable that Jesus was telling. Because if it was a parable, the story, and I'll read it here in a minute, where this Samaritan heals this man that's broken and hurting, well, the Samaritans were the enemies. So why would Jesus tell a story to a bunch of Jews that made the Samaritan look like the hero in the story? So they believe that as Jesus tells this story, there's people from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life, and they're all standing there listening. And so Jesus tells them this story, and they begin to lean in because it's a relevant story that has been circulating, and they're wondering, is there truth to this? So who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to a place and he saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. The one who gave him help. And Jesus just simply says, go and do likewise. And that's the end of the story. Jesus is basically saying, go and walk with him, care for him, put yourself in his position. Now keep in mind, 2,000 years ago, when this is happening, it's an unbelievably divided world. The Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. And so Jesus is speaking. There's probably a large group of people all around him, and every single one of them looks pretty different. They also have the Jews, and then they have the different levels of the people that are the priests, the people that know better, the dirty, the rotten. They have all these different things. And the Samaritans, the people of different color. And then you have his disciples and his followers, and they're all standing there. And I think every single one of them, when the question is asked, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus begins to tell this story that has been circulating, they all lean in. And then Jesus says, the Samaritan, the one that went out of his way, the one that showed hope, that showed love. This question, love one another, the statement becomes a question, love one another. love that person that looks completely different than me, I think they went from leaning forward to walking away. You see, that divided world of 2,000 years ago, unfortunately, is very similar to who we are today. And that cry for help. I've had friends that have asked for help, and I've gone through life with them, but what I realize is oftentimes we have a tendency to help the person that lives in the house that looks just like mine. We have a tendency to help the person that looks exactly like I do, has the same thinking that I do. I've found raising my voice for the person that I feel is being oppressed, and then I realize they have the same thoughts I do, the same concerns I do, the same voice that I do. I'm just hitting repeat and play. We stand up for justice for the person and only the person that has the same moral standing that I do. And what I realize is then what happens is we begin to put ourselves all in these separate bubbles, these separate worlds where we say, this is my world and that is your world. And I'm not even sure if I have the ability to cross over into yours. So that's the world that Jesus is speaking to. And I read this today, and that's the world, unfortunately, oftentimes we place ourselves in. You see, in Luke 5, Jesus is having a great banquet, it says. It says that it was filled with tax collectors and sinners. And they define sinners as prostitutes, thieves, people that you could look at and you could judge from what they look like. They are clearly sinners. You see, there's a difference, though, because the people that were calling them sinners, the people that were saying to Jesus, why are you having dinner with these people? Why are you sitting at the same table as them? Jesus says, you know what? You're not even teachable. Because what happened was that the people that felt like they were in the right, those that were holy, Jesus called them the unteachables. Because he says, I can't help you because you've placed yourself in such a safe, secure little bubble that you're not willing to even come outside and look at the perspective of the other. You're not willing to walk with the person that looks nothing like you. You're not willing to sit down with the person that may have completely different beliefs than you do. And yet Jesus walked the earth, and his teachings still are here to this day, where he says, my love is for every single walking, waking person on this planet. I was scrolling through Facebook, and I'll be honest, I've been off of social media a lot because it's hard. It's hard to sit there and read a lot of the comments. And this last week, I was reading a comment of a lady from the Grove, and she put one of Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon up. And she just put that up there with a few words, and I read through it, and it was so powerful, and it was interesting because I didn't realize this, and I've listened to almost all of his sermons, but I didn't realize that the last sermon that Dr. King ever gave was on the Good Samaritan. And in the sermon, he said this. He said, and finally, talking about the Good Samaritan, a man of another race came by. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but with him administering first aid and help this man in need. Jesus ended up saying this was the good man. This was the great man because he had the capacity to project the I into the thou. In other words, he sat down with him. The Good Samaritan got off his donkey. He got down on his knees. He bandaged him. He was willing to walk with the other. Love one another, period. Means I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to move my mouth. I'm just going to ask what do you need, and then I'm going to sit with you. You see, that Dr. King then went on to say this. He said, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over at the man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking. And he was acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to seize them over there, lure them there for a quick and early seizure. And so the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? You see, when you place yourself in that position, when you sit with the broken, when you sit with the hurting, when you sit with those that are struggling, you're eye to eye. You're becoming equal with them. And you're forcing yourself to change your perspective. You see, as Jesus is speaking, and he's telling this story, all around him were people of different colors, different backgrounds, different races, different perspectives, different thoughts. And he says, here's how you change the world. You love one another, period. You walk with them. You sit with them. You show them this love of Jesus. It can change the world. I think it's interesting that once this story is over, it then goes on to the story of Martha and Mary. And this is the next thing it says. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, 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 the Lord answered. You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. You see, there's 3 instances in the Gospels where Mary is mentioned. This passage here, where she's sitting at Jesus' feet and she's listening. In John chapter 11, she's crying because her brother Lazarus has died, and so she's crying at Jesus' feet, and her tears are dropping onto his feet. And the third time where she comes in John chapter 12, where she places herself at Jesus' feet and she rubs perfume on him. See, every single time she's mentioned, she's sitting at Jesus' feet. She's putting herself below him. As a kid growing up in Thailand, every time I walked into somebody's house, my parents taught me I had to keep my head down. You walk in, this is called a Y, and you say Sawadee Kap, and you'd keep your head down as a sign of respect. So now every time I go back to Thailand, or oftentimes when I enter the house of somebody older than me, I'll keep my head below them because it's a sign of respect. It's placing them above me. You see, and that's how we're called to live our life. When the whole world seems to be screaming, help, our opinion, our voice doesn't always need to be the one that's heard. But the voice of the hurting is the one that needs to be listened to. You see, what I've realized is the next generation of the church is watching us. They're looking at us. They're seeing how are we living out through these injustices, these tragedies, these hardships. It's like the world honestly has been flipped upside down. And you know, what I've realized is we have a tendency to then build our own bubbles of protection, of security. We have this way to live through life where we are surrounded with people that look like us and think like us and act like this. I can walk with someone and I can sit with them, and I don't have to agree with everything they say, but I can just be with them. You see, what I realized with raising a 2-year-old, he could care less if I'm a right-wing Republican or a left-wing liberal. He could care less if I was born in China, Mexico, where. He could care less what I did that day. He doesn't care my theology, my background. He doesn't care about any of that. He cares if I walk with him. He cares if I sit with him. He cares if I give him attention. He cares if I understand this meaning of this phrase that Jesus spoke about over and over again. Love one another. Period. That's it. My youngest daughter, Yuli, is an artist, and she has been watching everything that's been unfolding. She was born in Guatemala, and we've raised her here, and she's very aware of what people around her are saying, positive and negative. And she said that she's been struggling because everything she's reading online are her friends and her leaders and her adults, and she's seeing all these comments that aren't based in love, but they're just arguing back and forth. And she's saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this. She said, how do I process? What's the right thing to do? And so my wife was encouraging her and talking to her, and as she's asking my wife for help, my wife is saying, draw this out. Write it out. And so she sat down in her journal, and she began to write this out, and she put it up on Instagram this last week, and I asked her if I could read this. And so this is what my daughter said. She said, I've struggled for days with not knowing what to say and how to say it delicately. The world has never been perfect, but this has to stop. Justice is needed. Love is needed to heal the wounds of broken hearts and injustices. On so many people and families, of course, you are allowed to have an opinion, but you can't force people to agree or to listen. I pray for peace, for justice, for healing, for reconciliation. Take the time to have these conversations, but be aware of racism, be aware of injustice, and things that affect your community. We are all worthy of a beautiful life. So let's help those who aren't being treated like it. Some of us will never know what it feels like, but I'm proud of those who are willing to stand together. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. John 13:34, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another, period.